Lovecraftian sense. I'm kind of hinting at ideas around knowledges being hidden or hard to find, more than the knowledges themselves being kind of spooky in nature. I'm going to chat for about 35 minutes or so. And if you have any questions as we go through, please just put them in the chat. I've got my eyes kind of half on the chat. Very quiet, especially compared to intro. Okay, now I hear it does. Okay, we're good, I think. I'll move my mic a little bit closer. Hopefully that's better for everyone. Wonderful. So let's begin then. So knowledge is a really interesting thing, and it has so many different approaches and ways we can consider it. Obviously, there's kind of standard educational practices, those kind of social constructs, as it were. But then we also have these kind of community or subcultural knowledges, and they all have their own distinctive sets of ideas around what's important to them or what's not important to them, as well as their own informal educational practices. And I think something that's vital to consider here is that when we think of a body of community knowledge, it's through that community knowledge and the generation and formation of almost like a canon or a set of knowledge that forms part of that community identity. So you might think about kind of the way in which kind of skateboarders teach each other new tricks and perform that, or how real ale enthusiasts speak about beer and unpack its kind of complexities. There's a set of knowledges, and knowing and understanding means that people feel and identify more with a community. And it's through that kind of formation of knowledge that some may be able to judge ways of considering how much an individual engages with a hobby. So how much a part of a community someone is. And in that sense, through presenting knowledge and collating knowledge, an individual is able to demonstrate their engagement. And that kind of leads to this binary at the bottom here, this kind of idea that knowledge to capital to power. So in gaining knowledge, they're gaining kind of the tools of recognition within a community, and through gaining these tools of recognition, they become more powerful within a field, as it were. People listen to what they have to say, they want to hear them. So what we kind of see through that then is that power leads an individual to be able to obviously mobilize, lead, change, mold a community to an image of their choosing. I think one way we can kind of unpack this is by considering one of my participants from my ongoing research who spoke about the influencer Tom Vassell. So Toby, for example, writes that Tom Vassell is an immensely powerful man. If he likes something, it sells. If they, speaking about the Dice Tower, give it a glowing review, it will do well. I think this is a very interesting way to kind of sit, because what we see here is Toby explaining the way in which kind of ideas around social capital and power work. So in referring to Tom Vassell, he's noting that Vassell's voice and opinions mean something to a portion, usually a large portion, of the community as a whole. And more generally, as well as referring to Vassell, who is kind of a mainstay of the Dice Tower network, he's referring to the network as a whole. They have a large number of contributors, obviously outside of their salaried staff. However, the connections and associations with this network bolster the social capital of each of those individual reviewers. And this then means that ideas such as seals of excellence or seals of approval act as a way of being almost like a marker of quality, as something that an individual should want to engage with. We can see this with kind of various award processes, including the Spiel, as well as even the UKGE's own set of awards. So what we're thinking then is these markers of quality are shown through individuals who are demonstrating some sort of engagement and are being trustworthy almost. They're given a level of trust due to their knowledge and power within that community. So then we can think about that in another way. And we can think about the way in which Beatrix, for example, described. So she told me in an interview, I think we're quite careful about spending money on games. We tend to do a bit of research, watch a review, and try not to double up mechanically on games. So what we find here is that Beatrix is using this idea of knowledge in order to primarily help her engage with her collection building and play experiences. So by using the word research, there's a connection being made between watching a review and the reviewer who she is watching being perceived in some way as knowledgeable. And I suppose in a sense we can consider these reviewers as being influencers per se. I'm not a huge fan of the word influencer, but it does what it says on the tin. I suppose we could also call them kind of content creators, media personalities, celebrities within analog gaming. But what we find here is that with the word influencer, we're making a distinctive connection primarily between influence, so that is media, and economic activities of their consumers. So influencers influence and viewers spend. And in that sense, what we find is that much of the content that is produced by these influencers is focused on, I think, what people have tended to call kind of the cult of the new. So that idea there that much of the content is used by analog gamers in order to direct their spending and their purchasing within the hobby writ large. And this is primarily in the forms of reviews, for example, top 10 lists, you must have this, you must buy that, what's coming new to Kickstarter, etc., etc. And I think the most infamous example of this is probably getting a little bit old now, but we can talk specifically, say, about the Wheaton effect. So Will Wheaton's Will Wheaton's show Tabletop featured on Geek and Sundry. And this idea of the Wheaton effect was something that was written about by Starlit Citadel. And they refer to it to talk about kind of a spike in sales of a game once it had been featured on Tabletop as a show. And what we find is with productions such as in particular Fury of Dracula, that there was a large amount of sales that peaked following their appearance on the show, and that it became a game that people wanted to engage with and wanted to kind of buy, as it were. So more widely, though, we can see that influencers also have power to direct change and to kind of model the community in their wider cultures and practices. So what we can think about here maybe is the large amount of charitable giving, for example, that takes place within the community that is headed by these influencers as kind of centering figures who aid to kind of pull community together in order to focus on specific goals or purposes. Last year at the Expo, for example, there was a very large charity game of Happy Salmon, for example, that was raising money for, I believe it was cancer charity, but I can't quite remember. So what we need to think about then is where this kind of ideas of knowledge come from. And I've called this kind of hobby knowledges, and I'm pluralizing here, and I'm trying to do that in a way that's not just being kind of academically fancy for the sake of it, but really kind of underpinning that there is multiple forms of knowledges. And these multiple forms of knowledges are really diverse in nature, but at the same time, they also interrelate and coexist with one another in the same sphere. So, obviously, at the top here, I have Board Game Geek, and I think Board Game Geek is a good place to begin because it's really not that difficult to argue that Board Game Geek is the largest catalogue for analog gaming knowledge currently available. It acts as a hub space for considerable information, rulebooks, reviews, etc., etc., podcast discussion forums. But then we also have generic markers of kind of point values of games. So, on a scale of 1 to 10, how good is said game, or how complex is said game on a scale from like 1 to 5, 4 or 5. And BGG acts as this kind of complex hub in that sense. And it could be argued, I think anyway, that actually to engage fully with gaining knowledge through BGG, one actually requires prerequisite knowledge. And actually, what I find quite interesting is the number of YouTube videos on how to use BGG that are produced by various kind of influencers and media personalities. And these are kind of, as far as informality of education goes, these are more formal instructional videos. And they work in order to kind of give information in order to help you source the information you are looking for. So then after that, we have friendly local game stores. I think friendly local game stores exist in a slightly different spectrum, usually of face-to-face or at the moment, a more kind of one-on-one interaction. And this is, I'm not just speaking about owners or staff within these stores, but actually other customers themselves. And they act as kind of valuable transmitters of knowledge regarding analog gaming. And what we find here is that many friendly local game stores, for example, pride themselves on their ability to introduce people to the hobby or encourage people to try some new things or further promote their engagement in analog play. If we look, for example, at the spotlights in the kind of back of Tabletop Gaming magazine, for example, they usually speak with a store every month. And those stores, through kind of a brief analysis by myself, tend to focus on the communal aspect there and how they promote not only the goods they have for sale, but also the ability to instruct and encourage the people that attend their stores. So then we come to kind of YouTube, and I suppose much of YouTube in itself tends to be kind of an access point for many people who enter the hobby. You tend not to require any prerequisite knowledge per se to come into the hobby via YouTube, because a lot of the knowledge on YouTube is self-contained within a video. So you're given the tools you need to understand it within the video itself. Again, though, what we find is that much of the material on kind of YouTube in particular tends to be focused on these kind of reviews and primary initial engagements and kind of economically driven. So when we're moving forward from that, we have podcasts and blogs, and I'm not going to spend time talking about all of these because they do a lot of the same material. I think what I would like to pick up on is this idea of Game of Friends. And I think Game of Friends is a really powerful idea because, as many of my participants told me, and as I've spoke to many people about across this project, and it might be something you disagree with, and I'd be interested to hear if that is the case. You never just get into board games. And what we're speaking about here is the idea that usually there is someone who performs and engages with an introduction to the hobby. So it's usually the form of a friend who was introduced themselves. But what we see here is almost this kind of induction into analog play. And I think this kind of idea of induction is very interesting because we also hear, for example, of the tools of the trade to get people interested in gaming, the likes of gateway games, you know, your Ticket to Ride, your Pandemics, etc., etc. So what we find here then with this kind of induction into analog gaming, on the other side, we also talk about the way gamers think about this, and almost the, I suppose, analog gaming evangelization, we might talk about it, and the way in which gamers themselves take others through those induction processes in order to encourage them to become gamers. And in many cases, these were very personal processes. So I've spoken to participants who are now avid board gamers, but for years actively refused to play games with other members of their family or with their friends because they found them dull or boring, and now have spend hours every day playing games and weekends playing games and attend conventions across the country and the continent. So on the other side of that, though, that kind of leads into thinking about collections and the way in which individuals themselves pivot their collections in order to support these kind of processes of evangelization. So Beatrix, for example, who I spoke about before, wanted to keep a great example of each major mechanism of board gaming in her collection. This wasn't really because she liked all these mechanisms that she was keeping in, but she wanted to have them just in case she met someone she wanted to introduce and thought they would enjoy them. So what we see then is gamers developing these public collections that'll include curating lists, easing barriers to entry. Another option we find is when people are forming collections for public, such as in libraries or in bars, restaurants, students' unions. And one example was the adding of QR codes to rules videos on game boxes. This is a really exciting and engaging idea because, again, that kind of lessens the barrier to entry to the kind of learning process. Obviously, we have people who learn in different ways. We have people who are more visual learners, more kinesthetic learners, and therefore it's giving them multiple options of entry within into these games. So I think what that leads me to is kind of a way I'm trying to frame knowledge and knowledge exchange within gaming. And this is still a little bit hesitant, but I'm going to give some ideas and see what everybody thinks. So back in kind of the mid to late 90s, this idea around communities of practice was developed. And they were described by Lev and Wenger as being self-perpetuating in nature. So they should be led by and for individuals that are part of a community rather than by a party external to them. And they should be, in essence, based on the experience of gaining knowledge. So rather than gaining knowledge in theory, there should be a practical element to that. So by the playing of games, one learns about games, etc. Or by and through enjoyment and fun experiences, one gains knowledge. And in that sense, we can think about them almost in certain ways as being almost like a hidden educational practice. So given that gaming tends to be practical, experiential, we may consider it hidden because it, in a sense, it's the intention to play the game that drives the experience and not the learning that drives the experience. And at the same time, we're thinking about informality here as well. They're not taking place within traditional educational settings, but at the same time, they're offering a space for engagement, the development, for example, of soft skills, etc. So one of my participants spoke about the way in which she engages in pen and paper role-playing games with her children, for example, as a way of developing their kind of conflict resolution and problem-solving skills. Although that is something that they're building up resilience about, rather than it being centrally focused to the experience. But I think what we're thinking about here is that it's not just about teaching rules. So in the kind of the easiest way of considering a community of practice is to consider the teaching of rules. For the most part, the game will be taught and explained by the person who is most familiar and knowledgeable about that game. You don't really want a game being taught about someone knowledgeable about games in general if there's someone there that's played it before and knows what they're doing and the intricacies of that. And here then we're seeing a distinction that's forming between generalist and specialist knowledges of analog gaming, and that there is kind of a context-specific element to them. So there's this kind of contextual and experiential element that's present in both the play and practice of analog knowledge exchange. And I think when we're thinking about that, we can go out a little bit further and consider now these wider communities of practice. So not just around a table, but being involved in a wider community. Sorry, I just need some coffee. So at a bring and buy sale in a convention in the UK, I was conducting a walking interview with a woman called Ren. And we were talking and discussing kind of ideas around knowledge and games. And what I record here is a short exchange that took place between three people who, as far as I'm aware, did not know each other. So Ren initially says to me, look, he's got a copy of Kingsport there too. And then to him, do I want to ask you how much that copy is? The participant replies, me, it's £42. To which Ren replies, oh, good. And then she points at the copy and she's holding and says, oh, this one's 20. And then a second person chimes in and says, 20? I got one for half of that price yesterday. To which Ren retorts, this one's got all the expansions in it, though. And then the first person states, this is just the base game. The second person saying, ours did too, regarding the expansions, before turning to the first participant saying, that's a lot for that. You can get it new cheaper than that. To the first participant saying, oh, I think I might leave it. No signal in here. It's hard to check prices. So there's quite a lot to unpack here. I think the first one is, if we start from the bottom, participant one at the end has been told that the game he's looking at is quite expensive, £42 just for the base game. And he decides to leave it there, and he notes that there's no signal here, so it's hard to check prices. Obviously, the likes of Board Game Geek, Board Game Prices, etc., are ways in which people can check and exchange knowledge around prices for games. And as such, participant one understands that there are tools available, but at that time they had no access to look at them. Ren and participant two, on the other hand, have that knowledge of what they feel will be a new price, so an MSRP or an RRP, and what they would be willing to pay for it. They're also aware of the series of kind of expansions associated with the game, and therefore can understand and weigh that into their pricing structures. So what's more interesting here, though, is the way in which a consensus about this information develops. So there's a consensus that £42 is too much for a used copy, that £20 is pretty reasonable, and that participant two, for £10, got an absolute steal. But more importantly, what we're thinking about here is kind of these ideas of digital literacies and living in a digital age, how important understanding those digital literacies are. For example, we are at a virtual expo, We're engaging on various platforms in order to exchange and share our love of the hobby, but we're doing this via virtual means. So we're playing on tabletop simulators, for example. So we don't just need to have an understanding of the rules of the game we're playing, but we also need to have knowledge and understanding of the way in which these simulators are working. So there's an added layer there of kind of complexities and ideas. But I think to turn to that, I want to kind of go right back to the very start of the project that I started doing work on back in about 2018, doing field work. And that's a story of kind of two participants. And this was when I'd been a part of the community for a long time, but this was me going in and saying, right, I'm going to talk to people about board gaming in the UK and analog gaming in the UK. And Will, for example, he was one of my first participants, and he says, I played a game of Lunar Architects this morning. I don't know, how much do you know about all the different games? So there, Will is asking me, in essence, to confirm my understanding. He proved to be a very interesting participant, and actually moved forward with that to explain the way in which he tries to teach people about the kind of histories of mechanisms as they're being played and where kind of the development of mechanisms from games comes part. And then on the other hand, we had a snippet from a casual conversation regarding the project information sheet. So when you do research, you especially research in the field, you hand people a sheet, and that gives them some info about the project that they can talk about. And my participant information sheet had brackets. So it said board games, brackets, Pandemic and Ticket to Ride, role-playing games, brackets, such as Fate Core and D&D, and tabletop miniature games, brackets, Warhammer 40,000 and Malifaux, just to give people some examples. Interestingly, I hadn't wanted to put those in, and my ethics committee had told me that I had to give some examples. And what happened here is that this gentleman said to me, I really don't understand why you've listed these games on your flyer. We know what they are. And what we find here is that this gentleman becomes quite annoyed, almost in a sense that he found it belittling. Obviously, he perceived himself as having considerable knowledge, and as such, he almost felt undermined by my inclusion of those examples because there wasn't an opportunity for him to demonstrate his knowledge to me. Suffice to say, he decided not to partake with an interview with me at the time, but we have crossed paths since, and we've shared some really interesting conversations at various events across the country. So just to go back to what Will was saying, I think knowledge has obviously become quite central to what I'm doing, especially with the way people aim to demonstrate their knowledge, demonstrate the heritage of mechanisms of their favorite games, by tracing them and placing them into a wider corpus of kind of analog gaming history. And this is kind of what we do here, because when an individual is doing this, they're attempting to almost incorporate their own playful experiences into the history of analog play. As such, we find that gamers are using their conceptions of history as a form of capital, through which players frame themselves within the history of analog gaming and therefore within the kind of foundational community of analog play per se. But what happens then when we think of kind of post-initial acquisition at some point? So like with all learning curves, you gain a kind of a baseline body of knowledge after a certain length of time. And then what happens from there? So, as I mentioned before, these influencers and media producers tend to predominantly focus on the new and review games, usually with the intention of encouraging people to play new games, which is kind of synonymous with people buying new games. And as we continue to see the hobby develop, which is really exciting, and new reviewers kind of coming to the forefront, what we still see is that there tends to be a focus on the new and the gamer that is more new to the hobby. Though we are starting to see an undercurrent develop here of kind of individuals who are looking to focus on those who have this pre-existing knowledge. In this instance, it may be worth considering podcasts in particular. This Game is Broken, for example, as well as Sporadically Bored, two kind of British started podcasts that both work with the premise that their audience comes into their engagement with a level of knowledge about the hobby in general to understand what's going on. So This Game is Broken, for example, with those who kind of are unfamiliar with it, it's kind of akin to 8 out of 10 Cats in a sense, played over a series of rounds. The game show tests knowledges of teams, and they compete for kind of occasionally randomly awarded points. It's kind of a non-serious competition in that sense, though I'm not sure how much Matthew and the Brothers Mirth and Dan and etc. would agree with me about that. But what we find here is that the level required in some cases to engage with this podcast, the level of knowledge is quite high. So they will have, for example, say, specific rounds that they play a piece of music. So Dave Loser will play a piece of music that is based on a game, and they have to take these kind of ideas and kind of almost abstract concepts in order to work out what a game is. So what we're finding here then is, as the hobby grows, we're finding these kind of wider spread outs of kind of media that look to engage with people in this post-acquisition stage. And that is widely kind of a good sign for analog gaming, because it is only when the hobby reaches a certain kind of level of engagement and history and kind of age that we're able to move on to almost that next step, as it were. So it's great to see that there is a need and a want for that in the community, because it shows the ongoing development of the community itself. And I think that's what we're thinking about here when we're thinking about gamer life cycles and game acquisitions. And that in the beginning, at least, when one gets into playing games, there's definitely a relationship between the development of knowledge and the acquisition of games, at least in the first instance. So many of my participants I spoke to, when they first got into board gaming, they bought all the games, every game under the sun, every game that they could get their hands on, in order to have games and play games and enjoy games. And what we tend to find is that goes on for, say, a period of usually up to about 18 months, and is then followed by like a period of refinement, in which an individual takes all these experiences and knowledges gained and puts them together to work out and refine what it is that they really like about the hobby and what it is that they really enjoy about the community. And these processes of refinement take place in different ways for different individuals. It could be the number of players, for example. So I live with my wife, so I made a conscious decision in our refinement process that every game that we play has to have a minimum of 2 players, so we can play every game in our collection. We can think back to Beatrix, for example, who really enjoys introducing people to the hobby. So she keeps a lot of gateway games and hobby games that can help introduce people. Good examples of mechanisms. Other examples include individuals who define and refine based on either themes or mechanisms that they enjoy. I've spoken to people that will buy everything with a picture of Cthulhu on it because they love Cthulhu. And other people who adore coin games, and therefore they fit their collection entirely around coin-based games. So in this way, what we're finding is that there is these kind of processes of refinement, and it's through that refinement that can only take place once we have a set of kind of knowledges to work with and to play with. So in that sense, this leads to kind of ideas around specialist knowledges, in particular, the way in which we can kind of talk about specialist language, and kind of all communities have specialist languages. So in particular, we go through processes, especially in the English language, of co-opting language. I think within gaming, one of the best examples we can talk about here is the weight, or how heavy a game is. That's utilized along kind of within analog play in order to consider complexity rather than physical weight, which is talked about as kind of heft rather than the weight. And we also have a distinctive set of kind of references and markers that take place here that we use to communicate with other members. So what we define as a Euro game or an Amerithrash game or a legacy game comes with it a set of understandings about the general idea or the general feel of a game. We also then understand kind of conceptions around non-gamer friends or analysis paralysis, in which we have experiences and understandings of those feelings that we're engaging with, and we can share those with each other. So with these kind of reference points and these experiences and these understandings of the likes of Euro games or Amerithrash games, again, that sits us in the wider kind of corpus of experiences of analog game history, which is really exciting and really engaging. So that kind of leads me to kind of think about some conclusions, and I'm still working along a lot of these in the moment and why they fit in, where they fit in together to my research. In the first point, there's a distinctive pattern of gaming influencers and community members acting as educators. And I mean educators here in kind of a really kind of broad, informal sense. And in a sense that they want to be helpful, and that they're wanting to be helpful and nice and share. And I suppose this is the relationship here between sharing knowledge and educating and engaging people with the hobby. But at the same time, knowledge within analog gaming is power, and it can affect the status within communities. We can think of championships and competitions. We can think of kind of painting competitions and being very good painters. We can think of hosting kind of large-scale channels which give voice, and which voice can be heard by hundreds of thousands of people. But at the same time, I think it's worth considering the other side of this, and this almost kind of accidental or purposeful gatekeeping that can take place. And I've seen this a couple of times, and usually it's never being on purpose and usually never been purposeful. But I think as we move forward and as we think about the community as it continues to expand, we need to become aware of these processes of accidental gatekeeping taking place, and being aware that as people move into the hobby, they might not all have the same experiences as everyone around the table. And as such, it can usually be helpful to take some time to make sure everyone is kind of orientated to the same spec. On the other side, there's a QR code there. I wrote a piece recently for a journal called Leisure Sciences, which is open access, so you can access it there. It's kind of a commentary about playing analog games in lockdown in the UK. And what was interesting there and what came out of there related to knowledge was the way in which people with kind of more tech savvy kind of approaches and natures were able and actively helping others to continue their hobby and continue their gaming practices through technology by helping them to kind of overcome those barriers to entry into what is now digital analog gaming or analog digital gaming. I don't know which way around that should go. So yeah, that QR code there, you can access that. I'll post a link in the chat. But other than that, do we have any questions? I think we've got about 10, 12 minutes or so. So I'm going to kind of scroll back up and look at some questions.
The voice from the ether comes in. We have had a question. Do you think your research has been affected by COVID-19, and has it been a positive effect?
Oh, so do I think that my research has been affected by COVID-19, and has that been a positive effect? I think that's a really interesting one. COVID-19 has had a real hard effect on the community as a whole. And I don't think we can underplay that. I think the concerns not only for kind of large-scale events as well as smaller-scale events, and even down to individuals' mental health, has been really critical and really needs to be looked at further. Has it had an effect on my research? I think in the sense that I'm moving into a process of writing up, not as much as it probably would have had if it had been whilst I was conducting fieldwork. Has it had a positive effect? Positive effect is mainly that I've actually got a chance to play games, because something I've found now, having spent nearly 4 years writing a PhD part-time on board games, is that you don't play as many board games as you think you're going to within that time.
Another question we've had is, do you think the digital adaptations of the games has become a new gateway for people into the hobby?
Yeah, so digital adaptations for games has become a new gateway for people into the hobby. I think that's really interesting. I think what's really interesting, particularly for me now, is the way in which they're being marketed as digital applications to board games. Because in a way, we've always had digital board games, Sid Meier's Civilization, for example. But what we're finding now, and I think is really exciting, is that actually analog gaming is holding its own. So if there is a digital version, it's being made so clear that that is a digital version of a physical game, rather than kind of a transfer that's kind of erasing the kind of heritage of where that's come from. And I'm hoping to see that develop. I was watching, I think the advert on here before was for Scythe as digital version. I was wanting to try that because I don't actually own a copy of Scythe. So I was thinking of getting the digital version to have a look at that. We've got more time to play a game is always good. Yes, absolutely. I was thinking about gatekeeping as you were in the presentation. I have to see it come up on this one slide, but I think you're more optimistic about people only doing about that accident. Why so optimistic about people not seeing entry gamer enthusiasm as a threat to their gathered cultural capital? Because gamers are not necessarily more social than, say, comics. That's a really interesting idea, Andrew. I think we've got. I think what is coming to my attention a lot through this is that there's a lot of factors at play, and I think a lot of these factors are related to kind of social interaction as well as social structures. Because what we're seeing here is that there is definitely gatekeeping. I can't deny that there is gatekeeping, and that gatekeeping is especially prominent within well-established smaller game groups, I would argue. But I think what we're seeing more, kind of looking at the UK as a whole, is more push, especially by event organisers, to incorporate these kind of newer gamers or people looking to enter into gaming into those experiences. I think that's why the pressure comes back to us as gamers, like as a force of good. If we become the majority of actively and openly engaging people with the hobby, that can only help to kind of encourage them. We've got
one here from before. Do you think supermarkets should stock a large range of games, or should it stay with the harder to reach in smaller shops or online?
Do you think supermarkets should stock a larger range of games, or should it stay with the harder to reach smaller shops and online? I think that is a really difficult one. I think because of kind of limited print runs of some games, for example, it can be very hard for them to reach the numbers of sales required for a supermarket to consider stocking them. But I think what we're seeing is that there should obviously be an increase, and there should be a range of games available in stores and in supermarkets. However, I think they need to be quite carefully chosen. And I don't know what the best way is in order to do that. It's obviously not going to be possible for every game that your friendly local game store has to be stocked in the supermarket, because like, I'm never going to see Twilight Imperium in Tesco. I'd love to, but I'm never going to see Twilight Imperium in Tesco. So I think anything that we can do, though, to introduce people is great. And I think maybe if we don't have more games in supermarkets, for example, there needs to be more of a push, maybe within kind of schools or libraries as well, because the games in libraries kind of movement is growing quite a lot further, in order to kind of spread the word. I'm sorry, my dog is muttering, so I'm just going to let her out.
We all love dogs and cats here on Twitch. They're our favourite people.
Yeah, she was whining. I think someone's just making food downstairs.
Oh, nice.
Do we have any?
So there was a comment about, do you think there is an oversaturation of games potentially crashing the hobby?
Oh, an oversaturation of games potentially crashing the hobby. I think we're at the point now where I think on the last count we're on about 3.5 new items being released per day. But I think, again, what I'm noticing, and this is speaking as a general gamer rather than someone researching on games, I think we're seeing kind of less evergreen titles coming to the forefront, in the sense that, like, I suppose the last game that I thought, oh, this is going to stay in my collection for forever, is probably kind of Azul, which was a few years ago now. I don't know if it's going to potentially lead to a crash in the hobby. I think there's some interesting changes in practice at the moment that we're seeing. So, like, expansions to games seem to be, on the whole, becoming, I would argue, less popular than they once were. And that, obviously, in that sense, that leads to more games which can be put together but don't have to be put together. So the likes of Century Spice Road, for example, that series, they all play separately and they all play together. I think maybe the hobby is not growing as fast as things are being released, but I think what we also have to think about as well is kind of the ability for people to create games, and kind of the barriers to entry, for example, for production of games has been significantly reduced. So we're no longer limited to just games from like major companies, so the likes of Z-Man, Asmodee, etc., etc. But everyone can be a game designer in some ways. That's absolutely fantastic. Some of my most enjoyable games have been Kickstarted games. But on the other hand, that does mean in some cases that there is less, how do we put it, almost quality control taking place. And that can then lead to kind of things being kind of misrepresented or misseen. But I think that's a wider conversation that the industry needs to have. I think we've probably got time for one more question. Everyone can be a game designer. Is he linking to the next seminar? Yes, yeah, absolutely. Go and watch Bez. Stay for Bez. She's wonderful. Please, that's absolutely great. Let's see. Let's see. Is there any last one? Shared language gaming. Yeah, so Gordon Hall was just saying in the US supermarkets they're stocking more gateway games. It'd be interesting to see if that would go in the UK eventually. I think it will, even if it's mainly kind of in online supermarkets for the time being. But I think what we need to be kind of thinking about is the way in which we can explore and find new ways to introduce people to games. And at the same time as them being introduced to supermarkets, I think, especially at the moment, given everything that's going on, we need to support our local stores. So I would really encourage everyone to support independent publishers, support local game stores, and try and work to build kind of a stronger and better community. 52. Okay, I have like a few seconds left. So I have to give you a reminder that there is a link in the chat for a badge, which I believe is called Twitcher, which you can access. But other than that, I think I'd just like to really thank everyone for taking the time to come and listen to my ramblings.
It's been a pleasure to have you, Matt. I've always loved your seminars. Last year was a delight, and this year is just the same. Where can folks find you if they want to learn a bit more or maybe continue the chat?
Yeah, so the easiest place to find me is on Twitter. I'm at Matt Coward-Gibbs on Twitter, or you can find me in most kind of board game Facebook groups, Board Game Trading and Chat UK, or my email is matt.coward@york.ac.uk. So I'm at any of those places, and I'd love to hear from anyone who wants to chat a bit more about this.
Thank you. Stick with us, folks. After Matt, Bez will be here, and she's going to be sharing that games design is for everyone. We're going to take a short moment to change over. Have a wonderful day. We'll be back shortly.